So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Xinting Yu, who received her bachelor's in space physics at the University of Science and Technology of China and her PhD in planetary science at Johns Hopkins University, where she studied sand transport and dune formation on Titan. And Dr. Yu is currently a 51 Peg B postdoctoral fellow at UC Santa Cruz, studying Titan and exoplanet atmospheres. So Dr. Yu, I'll leave it over to you.
All right, thank you. So as many of you have noticed, I came from like very different backgrounds. From space physics to planetary science, and finally I'm doing exoplanets now. So today, actually, my talk is entitled "How to Identify Surfaces on Exoplanets Without Seeing Them." But the talk will actually be two parts. So this will be the first part of my talk, which is a theoretical project that I can just kind of had idea with, and then we're just doing this, I think, pretty cool study. And the second part of my talk will be a laboratory study that's gonna be published soon, next Tuesday on Nature Astronomy. And that can help us understand really the diversity of exoplanet hazes and how that's going to affect the diversity of haziness in temperate exoplanets atmospheres. So I'm going to get started with this work. So the idea is basically, can we see the surfaces on exoplanet, but without really seeing them? Okay, so how, I'm just gonna get started here. By the way, the paper is published at IPJ already, so the DOI can be found here if you're interested in reading the paper. All right, so we know that in the solar system, we have the terrestrial planets, which tend to have relatively thin atmospheres with kind of smaller surface pressure around less than 100 bar. So I'm talking about the extreme haze of 100 bar, which is for Venus. So Venus has a surface pressure of 92 bars, while Earth has a surface pressure much lower of 1 bar. But all these planets tend to have pretty thin atmospheres. Now, if we look at the giant planets, for example, Uranus and Neptune, we know that they're really big and they don't really have something called a surface. And if there's anything that we define as surface, maybe as a gas or some sort of gas transition, gas to liquid or gas to solid transition boundary, that's going to be very deep, probably over a kilobar. So, and we have these many exoplanets that actually in between the sizes of terrestrial planets and the ice giants. And we're just wondering, hey, where are their surfaces located? And are they closer to the so-called super Earths, to the terrestrial planets have shallow surfaces, or are they closer to the so-called mini Neptunes, which have deep surfaces and thick atmospheres? So, and this is really important because actually these type of intermediate sized exoplanets are found to be the most abundant that has been discovered so far. So we really need to get to know like which type are they closer to. Another reason why knowing the surface is important is because some astrobiological reasons. So I would like to argue that I don't think there will be any complex form of life that can survive just on a solely atmospheric world, because it's hard to just kind of keep a biosphere there just without a surface, I would say. You may think of Venus, which people have argued in the last year may have phosphine and maybe life, but I think at least we can say we don't expect there to be any complex form of life there. And knowing the surface can actually tell us something about planet formation too. So the current, there are kind of current two parts of theory to explain this observed frequency of exoplanets. So the first theory is the kind of more popular one, the Maslow theory, which basically said the smaller planets are just highly irradiated, and then they finally lost most of their atmospheres, leaving pretty much just bare rocky cores, while the higher radius planets, they are less irradiated, so they get to keep their atmosphere and that are very thick. The other theory I would say is slightly less popular but hasn't been ruled out yet is the volatile rich world theory. So it still assumes a small planets lost most of their atmospheres, but they are saying if they add the ice layer into the interior composition, then they don't have to have this extreme of no atmosphere and lot of atmosphere. They can just have, by varying this ice layer, they can just naturally have the peak of radius around 2.2 to 2.4. So knowing the surface location can really just kind of distinguish these two theories. So if we're seeing for most of these planets, if everything tend to have surfaces, then that probably going to indicate the volatile rich-world theory holds true. While it's everything like has no surface at all, then probably that's kind of proven the more popular mass law theory. So it's pretty important to do that. All right, but it's really hard to do for upcoming observations at least. So the more transit, so these are the two techniques that are pretty popular to do like exoplanet observations, transit and direct imaging. So for transit, which is the big thing now, and it's going to be the big thing in the near future with Hubble, the James Webb Telescope, and soon the Ariel European mission. So this technique itself is not really sensitive to the surface. And then there's something else that's kind of annoying, which is clouds and hazes, because their opacities, there tend to be some opacity or sources in the atmosphere to block the atmospheric signal. So this is not a good technique to really directly detect surfaces. So direct imaging is actually a good technique. It's actually sensitive to the surface because we're seeing emission directly from the surface. But we just don't have a good enough telescope to resolve planets that are small, like as small as we're interested in, so 1, 2, 3 Earth-sized. And also, you can't really see the surface if the atmosphere gets too thick. So if we're talking about maybe 100 bar, several hundred bar atmosphere, you probably can already see the surface. So it's hard to do, okay? And we just kind of have this idea. I have this idea originated from two planetary bodies actually in the solar system, Jupiter and Titan, and two trace species in the atmosphere, ammonia and methane. So we know that Jupiter has no surface or a very deep surface, and Titan has a shallow surface of 1 bar and 94 Kelvin. Okay, so now we look at the fate of these two species. So both of these species in the upper atmosphere will be constantly broken apart by UV photons, and ammonia will just be converted to nitrogen, and methane will be converted constantly to the hydrocarbons. And for Jupiter's case, because there's no surface, these photochemically formed species will just kind of diffuse towards the deep, hot part of the atmosphere. And because it's a hydrogen-rich atmosphere, the photochemically formed nitrogen and hydrocarbons will just be converted back through thermal chemistry to ammonia and methane. And these two will just get diffused upward again. So in the end, it's not surprising that Jupiter still has lots of ammonia and methane. So we did not never question their existence. While for Titan, because there's only a shallow surface that's kind of cuts off the thermal chemistry happening in the deep hot part of the atmosphere, what's happening is that N2 nitrogen will just be staying around in the atmosphere. And that's why we're observing Titan to be a 95 to 98% nitrogen atmosphere. While methane, they will just be converted to hydrocarbons, and the hydrocarbons has nowhere to go but to be deposited on the surface. That's why we're seeing vast linear kind of dunes made of organics on Titan's surface. And if you're interested in dunes, I have a whole PhD thesis on that. They're pretty interesting. But in the end, this process just keeps going, and it's because it's irreversible, nothing gets to replenish back the ammonia and the methane. In the end, we are expecting depleted ammonia and methane in Titan's atmosphere. So Titan is a really weird object because we're still seeing about 25% of methane. But the Cassini-Huygens measurement tells us from the isotope measurement that the methane is probably coming from interior outgassing instead of being accreted from the beginning. So there's some other source to replenish the methane. So, but it's still an unsolved mystery why there's still some methane in Titan's atmosphere. Anyways, So having this dichotomy between Jupiter and Titan and the abundances of nitrogen and methane, so I just had this idea, maybe we can use the abundances of these kind of photochemically fragile species to tell us if an exoplanet has a surface or not. So to test this idea, we have this wonderful collaborator, Julian Moses, and we used a state-of-the-art photochemical model, the JPL, Caltech JPL kinetics model, and we used the model to test a model planet, and here we choose K218b, so both with and without surfaces. So on the left, I'm showing you a pressure temperature profile we used for K218b, and for this study, we just simply cut at different pressure levels the PT profile and then run the models. All right, so let's first look at ammonia. So here I'm showing you a pressure mixing ratio plot for ammonia. So if mixing ratio towards the right means it's more abundant. All right. The dashed line is the, actually we run the thermochemical equilibrium model first, and this is the abundance predicted with just thermochemical equilibrium. And then the thick gray line is the no surface case. So that's adding photochemistry and transport to the thermochemical equilibrium model, and that's a no surface case. All right, now we're adding a surface of 100 bar. So we notice ammonia abundance has not changed at all. And we think this is because at this surface level, it's still hot enough so ammonia can be fully recycled back to the atmosphere. And now, if we add a 10 bar surface, okay, now you're seeing a decrease of ammonia of several orders of magnitudes. And we think this is because at this surface level, it's slightly cold, it's colder. So not all ammonia can be recycled back. But there's still some recycling going on. That's why we're seeing a non-zero ammonia, but its abundance dropped a lot. And if we add even colder surface, we're seeing a more significant drop of ammonia. And then there's another species that behaves basically the same as ammonia, and it's hydrogen cyanide. So it's sensitive to all 1 bar and 10 bar surfaces. And this is because HCN is a direct derivative of ammonia. So basically, the more ammonia is produced, tend to produce more HCN as well. And now let's look at methane. So again, same plot. We're first adding a 100 bar surface. So nothing changed, and now we're adding to a 10 bar surface. Okay, you notice this is different compared to ammonia. Still nothing changed for a 10 bar surface. So we think for carbon species, it needs to fully recycle carbon species back. Actually, cooler temperature is needed. So at 10 bar, it's still hot enough to fully recycle methane back to the atmosphere. And now if we add a 1 bar surface, we're seeing some decrease, and methane is a relatively abundant species. So there's actually a lot of decrease for methane. So at 1 bar, because it's cooler, not all methane can be recycled back to the atmosphere. And another species that behaves the same as methane is water. And I'll explain a little bit later what's happening here. But both of them are only sensitive to 1 bar surface with decreased abundances compared to the no surface case. And there's another group of species that behave the same basically as methane. And these are the hydrocarbons. And they're only sensitive to 1 bar surfaces as well. And basically, this is because hydrocarbons are direct derivatives of methane. So the more methane you produce, the more methane there are, the more hydrocarbons there are, and vice versa. And there's actually a group of species that are sensitive to 1 bar surface as well, but they have increased abundances compared to the no surface case. And these are CO and CO2. And by just doing this kind of plots for the major species, we can just group them into 4 groups. And each of the group of species, they are all sensitive to different surface levels. So why is this happening here? So now I want to remind you about the Jupiter-Titan dichotomy for a second. So this is not exactly what's happening in the atmosphere of K218b. This is because we have oxygen, so it's slightly more complicated. But basically what's happening is that all the photochemically fragile species like methane, ammonia, water, they can all be considered photochemically fragile. They are constantly being depleted for the shallow surface or like shallow surface case. And they're constantly converting to the photochemically more stable species, such as CO and CO2 and nitrogen. So so we would be able to say for these kind of scenario, the shallow surface case tend to have less photochemically fragile species and the more photochemically stable species. And another cool thing we notice is that so ammonia and methane kind of has the sweet points where they get fully recycled is actually different for them. So for nitrogen species, slightly hotter and deeper, while for carbon species is more shallower and cooler. So how can we use this result to do a surface identification on exoplanets? So we first did some sensitivity studies. So we did some eddy diffusion coefficient profile, different eddy diffusion coefficient profile, different slightly different temperature pressure profile and different intrinsic temperature, stuff like that. And then we choose criteria that works for all the cases with different tests. And now we selected 7 criteria that are robust for different varying parameters. And how this works is basically once we have atmospheric characterization for a planet like K218b, we're gonna get the species abundances, so X with a bracket here. And then we first look at the species that are sensitive to a relatively deep surface, ammonia and HCM. So if the observed ammonia and HCM abundances are close to the no surface predicted abundances, then we would immediately say that there's probably a surface deeper than 100 bar. Well, if it's less than the no surface case, then we would go to the species that are more sensitive to a shallow surface, the carbon species. And then we would look at these criteria to say whether if they have a shallow surface or a intermediate surface. So this framework is really nice. You'll notice there are multiple criteria in each step, and you have to fit all the criteria. So you might wonder, like, what would happen if there's one criteria just different from the other one? So we could probably say something like there's probably some surface process related with that, or surface or interior process that's related with that species. So for example, it could be some volcanic outgassing. So for Titan, I'm just giving an example that's not great there, but we're gonna see a methane abundance probably bigger than one, but the other ones are gonna be, the same. Just give a bad example. But so far, this flow chart only works for hydrogen dominated like K218b, like exoplanet. So the parameter space is kind of narrow here, and I just submitted XRP proposal to expand the parameter space. And I'm really excited to do some cooler stuff like water dominated atmospheres and CO2 dominated, and see how the chemistry is going to change. And of course, a larger parameter space, not just K218b. And the goal is to hopefully find a common criteria that would work for no matter what kind of atmosphere you are. There are some robust criteria we can use to tell if there's a surface. So this brings to the conclusions of the first part of my talk. So you can ask questions at the last, or if you have any urgent questions, you can ask now. But I will just keep going for this to the second part. All right. So I just talked any questions?
I think Avi had a question, if you don't mind answering, Dr. Yu.
No problem.
Yeah, really, really interesting work. I guess my sort of question, since this is, as you say, a very sort of theoretical study looking at, constraining this factor about the surface, what are the uncertainties in things like photochemistry or other sources and sinks of these molecules that may make it more fuzzy, more challenging to actually constrain that factor? I'm speaking from someone who's not an atmospheric chemist myself, and so but I am aware that obviously there are many challenges to photochemical modeling, and certain atmospheres, and so there may be other factors. I guess I was wondering if you had examined that.
So this is a great question. There are totally like tons of things that we could not, or we have not account for. And I kind of have that, just dump that into the discussion. But anyways, just a couple of things that are significant. First, the photochemical models, we know certain reactions going on there. And, we have measurements for certain temperatures that are does not really apply to exoplanet conditions, right? So that's kind of the weakness for the photochemical model. And the second thing, I would say the most uncertainty comes from actually the pressure temperature profile. But because like what kind of surfaces you're going to be at, like, that really depends on the PT profile. And I hope we can get a good retrieval on that, but that's kind of going to be a big uncertainty for sure. And certain things are guessing, like surface kind of interior atmospheric interactions. So that's actually gonna be including, a future study that's also including the XRP. So we're gonna kind of test sensitivity. So we're gonna use the maximum possible outgas, for example, for methane, and see how much it's gonna change the result or not. So that's something we're gonna get tested. Hopefully, fingers crossed, one XRP. But we're gonna do a lot more in the future studies, hopefully. And hopefully that answers the question.
Cool. Great. And I think we can do one more question right now, Prabal. And then Ravi, if you don't mind holding on your question till the end, just so we make sure we get through the second part.
Awesome. Thanks. I'm really interesting work, because I think being able to figure out some surface information is fascinating. The question, I was initially worried about what if you had metallicities that are uncertain, or interior temperatures that kind of drive PT profiles, things like that. But as kind of a solution, if you can do kind of multi-band observations and probe different atmospheric levels, is there a way to kind of look at abundances as a function of kind of the pressure levels to kind of stratify this even more and be able to pin down a pressure surface level? I
think so. So the transit technique is kind of sensitive to like 10 to the -4 to like 1 bar, kind of that range-ish. I would say like for the photochemical model part, so I kind of, so if I could do this part, so this is extracted from 10 to the -4 bar, I think. And if I do, yeah, it should be, if doing multiple levels, and if it's still like kind of the observation holds true, like, for the flow chart, then I'll say that's definitely a more like robust detection. And I just hope that we can constrain the pressure temperature better. Temperature is more important because it's basically just how hot the surface is, and that, how hot, and determine how much thermochemistry is happening to recycling stuff. So hopefully that makes sense.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so now I get to go to the second part. This is actually painful, maybe a little bit painful. So I just talk about a technique that's pretty cool that uses atmospheric characterization to tell how hazy, so how can we identify surfaces on exoplanets? But first, we need to have good atmospheric characterization data. And this is kind of the annoying part, because sometimes we don't, because there are some opacity sources most of the time in exoplanets, especially cooler and the ones we're interested in. And I'm going to talk about photochemical cases, annoying part, and some insight through laboratory measurement that shows the diversity of photochemical cases and the diversity of exoplanet haziness. So that paper is going to come up next Tuesday in Nature Astronomy. So stay tuned for that. All right. So again, transmission spectroscopy, this is a perfect scenario. We're seeing lots of spectra. We're seeing spectra that are nearly perfect for us to identify molecules, okay? But this is kind of, the hope. But sometimes the reality is like a flat spectra with not much features. And we think this is probably because there are some opacity sources in the atmosphere that's kind of blocking the atmospheric signals. And most of the time we think there are clouds and hazes that exist to do that. All right, so I would say clouds are less painful because there are just certain types of stuff that can condense in the atmosphere. And people do mixed cloud stuff, but again, you're doing like 2-3 types of clouds, right? But for photochemical hazes, they are very annoying because, as we study Titan, we have studied them for like, 20, Cassini was there for 13 years. We still haven't figured out really the hazes. Because first, they're made just of thousands and maybe tens of thousands of different chemical compounds. And second, it's just really hard to like know all the properties, I would say. So we don't really know much about them. And, once you just a little bit, change in like the gas composition of the atmosphere, stuff like that could totally change the property of the hazes. And they're really annoying because if you look at the condensation curves of different cloud condensates, you notice around 300 to 600 Kelvin, kind of the temperate side of exoplanets, we don't have much condensates here. So pretty much all the opacities we're kind of seeing around this temperature range is probably coming from photochemical hazes. All right, so there's actually previous some laboratory work that happened during at my lab during my PhD. So there's a range of photochemical hazes that are produced in the lab, and we kind of see it just ubiquitously produced. So I'm gonna tell a fun story about this whole project kind of. So this is showing you the apparatus. So we kind of modified the Titan apparatus to do exoplanets. And we kind of, this is first we have the chicken egg problem. Because of the hazes, we can't really know what's in the atmosphere, right? But now we have to start with some gas composition to do this. So how do we do this? So in the end, we choose to use a thermochemical equilibrium model to predict what could be in the atmosphere given some metallicity and some temperature. And here's just kind of the messy gases we kind of have. And these are just the most abundant gases and that we can do realistically. But we kind of made a bet, like, how many of these can actually produce like hazes? And I was saying like 3. But in the end, all of the experiments, all 9, actually 18, because we used 2 different energy sources, produce at least a couple layers of molecules. So that really proves that, no matter what kind of gas composition you throw into this bottle, you're producing hazes. All right. So if we kind of gather the experimental data, the production rate data kind of shown on the left, the general trend is that with increasing temperature, you're getting less haze produced. And on the right, I'm showing you the observations we compiled by my student, Austin Demont. So it's a water amplitude versus equilibrium temperature trend. So the water amplitude is a metric to quantify the haziness for exoplanets. So if you have a larger water amplitude, means the spectra is less featureless. While if it's small, for example, like, the JJ 1214b, the famous flat spectra is here. So the lower water amplitude it is hazier. Okay, so this experimental trend can well work to explain the right part of the water amplitude. So planets would get less hazy when the temperature is higher. But it doesn't really explain the left part. So you would expect more haze to be formed, okay? But it seems like we're detecting actually clearer atmospheres over there. So I think haze production rate alone cannot really explain the current trend we're having. And now we have to look at some other things. So just imagine, we have photochemical hazes, gases irradiated by UV photons producing the hazes with some production rate. And then we have to remove them somehow. Otherwise, these things just accumulate in the atmosphere, right? So there are 2 ways to remove stuff. The first way is called dry removal. So this is basically by colliding the particles and forming bigger ones so they can be gravitationally settled to the deeper atmosphere or to a surface. And the second way is called wet removal. So that basically is using the small haze particles as cloud seed for cloud condensates. And the clouds would just kind of naturally remove the hazes by either raining down or just sinking, kind of settling deeper into the atmosphere. All right. And then the total removal rate will be the 2 removal mechanism rate added together. So if we have the production rate a lot higher than the removal rate, then we're going to end up having a very hazy atmosphere. While if it's about the same or something like that, then we'll say it's less hazy. So removal is really important, actually, determining how hazy atmosphere can get on top of production. But both of these removals are actually very material dependent. We decided to measure a very important material property that governs how we remove stuff, and this material-dependent removal process. And that's primarily is called the surface energy. So for those of you who don't really know anything about surface energy, it's basically the energy that's needed to separate a piece of material into two chunks. So that tells you how cohesive this material is. So basically, the higher surface energy means more energy is needed, so it's more cohesive. And this directly links to how we dry remove stuff. While since we know how sticky it is, we can also predict how it sticks to other things like cloud condensates. And this is the wetting, so-called wetting property and the wetting theory. And that can directly tell us the wet removal of this material. So we just, first ran a bunch of hazy experiments at a different range of temperature and gas composition, as I already showed. And this is, I'm just showing you the colors of these done by the amazing Chao He at Johns Hopkins University. So they do show diversity already in colors, okay? And then we just measure the surface energy of these kind of thin films we produce with particles. So this measurement is actually pretty simple. You have a layer and you don't need much material. So a couple molecular layers of material is enough to do this measurement. So you just drop different types of liquid, a nonpolar one and a polar one. And you measure the contact angle formed between the liquid and this haze sample we produce in the lab. So the nonpolar liquid and the polar liquid kind of respectively detects the nonpolar part of the dispersive part and the polar part of this material. And I'm just showing you an example. So for the Titan haze, this is the numbers we're getting. So I'm just going to tell you that it's relative. So 68, that's a relatively large number. So it's pretty cohesive. And there's a pretty big polar component of 28. So it means that Titan's haze is has a lot of polar structures in the chemical structure. All right, so let's look at the data for exoplanets. So you're seeing a lot of different numbers, and that's good. So you're seeing numbers as low as 28, as high as 70, okay? So that indicates a diversity of cohesiveness. So 28 is really low, actually thinking about something like Teflon or like some plastics that are not really adhesive. So they're not really sticky. Well, 70 is relatively high. So they're pretty sticky. So just, first glance, we're producing particles with a diversity of cohesiveness, and that will lead to a range of dry removal rates. All right, so now let's add into the kind of components, a nonpolar and polar part. So something you notice that, again, a diversity. So some of the hazes has tiny polarity, so they are pretty much all nonpolar, and some of them have huge polar components. But in general, we think kind of somehow there's a magical temperature around 400 Kelvin, and we kind of tend to produce the lowest hazes with the lowest polarity and the lowest surface energy there. And even though you might notice each of the experiment has different gas compositions, some of the experiments have similar ones, and somehow 400 Kelvin is a magical temperature that gives us the lowest surface energy. All right, so the polar component actually means something for wet removal because, for example, if the measured contact angle between water, a polar liquid, does depend on the polar part. So the lower polar part, if you remember this one, it's gonna return you a higher contact angle. All right, so this is gonna give us a diversity of wet removal rates. And this is because, when a haze is interacting with the moisture, a good CCN. So now we're introducing the concept of cloud condensation nuclei. So a good cloud condensation nuclei is easy to be removed, okay? So for a good CCM, it's generally either soluble or have low contact angle with the condensates. And we did some solubility tests, and pretty much none of them have good solubilities. But they all, for the ones with low contact angle, they can be efficiently wet removed, while the ones with bigger contact angles, they can't. But anyway, if you remind of this contact angle plot I'm showing, lots of the stuff actually cannot be efficiently removed. And again, the 400K cases, most of them, it's hard to be wet removed. So now I'm going to remind you back to this kind of production removal mechanism stuff. So let's look at the fate for low surface energy hazes and high surface energy hazes. Okay, so for low surface energy hazes, because they're less sticky, they have low dry removal rates because they can't just grow to bigger particles easily. And because they're less sticky, they also don't stick to condensates very well. So they would tend to have low removal rates, wet removal rates. So in the end, because the removal is all pretty low, if it's the same production rate, then we're gonna tend to have a hazy atmospheres if the haze is in the atmosphere's low surface energy. While if it's high surface energy, then it's easily removed both through dry and wet because it's just very cohesive, so it bonds to stuff very well. And then it's removed efficiently, leading to less hazy atmospheres. All right, so now I'm combining the experimental measured stuff, which the production rate, if you remember, is shown down here, and then the total surface energy trending with experimental temperature, the polar part, and then the predicted contact angle. So basically at 400 Kelvin, we always produce the hazes with the lowest surface energy. So the removal rate is always lowest here. And because the production rate is relatively high, we would say that probably we're going to see some really hazy stuff over there. Well, another temperature range we're having is the around 300 to 600. And if you remember, I said we don't have much condensates over there. And because wet removal has proven to be very important, for example, on Earth, it counts for, I would say, 80% of the removal. So since there's not much condensate there, we think it's also going to be hazy over there. Well, if we turn to the colder habitable planets, habitable temperatures, then because the surface energy higher, things get removed easier. I would actually expect to see less hazy exoplanets over there. And same reason applies for the hotter planets as well. And also the production rate is lower there, so it's really nice. But anyways, these kind of trend were predicted with experimental data incorporating both production and removal actually nicely explains the current haziness trend we're seeing. So this is pretty good. And this brings to the conclusion of this part of the work. So, the diversity of haziness matters and haze removal actually matters. And we're actually going to predict habitable exoplanets that could be less hazy. So that's actually good for us. And now finally, it's the conclusion of my whole talk. So I would say it's really nice that exoplanet science has both, it started from the astronomy side, but now we're having more planetary people involved. So planetary people like me feels really nice because, sometimes there are just some things we take for granted for solar system planets, but they could be great inspiration points for studying exoplanets. And also I hope I've proven to you we can kind of use this technique, just using the atmospheric characterization data to show if there's a surface or not without really seeing them. And lastly, I think we just need more laboratory work. In general, if you want to know photochemical hazes better because they're just so diverse. And, in order to really understand each of the planets, we just need to get more lab data on different, chemical and temperature and all these experimental conditions that leads to the production of hazes. So I'll just leave it there and, let me know if you have any questions.
That was an awesome talk, Xinting. Really cool with the haze results you got there. So if anyone has any questions for Dr. Yu, feel free to raise your hand or post them in chat. I think I'll start with a question that Ravi Koparapu had. I don't think he's on anymore, but he put it in chat. I think this was more towards the first part of the first section of your talk, looking at K218b. Mm-hmm. But Ravi asked, how are they getting the pressure temperature profiles in their model?
Okay, I guess he meant how do we get the with surface one. So now we're just simply cutting the pressure temperature profile. So we don't do anything. We just leave, this part, which is, I wouldn't say it's very realistic because we did not account for the surface. atmospheric interactions. So that's the next thing we're going to do. We're going to modify the PT profile code. Well, it started from Titan, so we just need to kind of enable that surface module. So that would more realistically predict what's happening kind of around this side, towards the surface. So he's not there, but hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, hopefully. And then I think he also asked if there was any photochemistry in that model.
Oh, there he is. That's amazing.
Okay.
We have some photochemistry, but yes, yeah, photochemistry. Otherwise, for example, it's a 100 times metallicity case. Otherwise, we will not have any CO2 if we're just doing thermochemical equilibrium models, as you can see. Yeah.
Gotcha.
All right.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions? I don't know if Vlad is still on. Vlad, did you want to ask your question? You might have had to run. I actually had a question about the this last section you just did with the hazes. On that plot where you showed the, I think like the very last results plot you have here. Yeah. So you probably mentioned this, I might have missed it, but where does Titan actually fit in on this? Because that kind of makes it look like it shouldn't be that hazy.
So Titan kind of is like over here. So it's kind of,
right.
It's off this plot, I would say. So, but it's kind of, oh yeah, that's, so okay, on Titan, well, the thing is like there's not actually much stuff that condensates. So like that's why I did not really explain what's happening here, because
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So pretty much I'm just doing the habitable planets with water as the condensate. But you go to lower temperature, there are other weird condensates.
Okay, gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. And does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, well, if not, thank you so much again for speaking with us today. It was really, really cool work.
All right, thank you. And yeah, glad to see everybody virtually. Yeah.
All right. Well, take it easy, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.